There is a question that millions of men privately carry, and almost none of them ever ask out loud. Research from the Kinsey Institute found that male anxiety about physical adequacy is one of the most prevalent and least discussed sources of psychological stress in men over 50. More prevalent than financial worry, more prevalent than career concern. Yet the medical community rarely addresses it directly, openly, and with the respect it deserves. So today, we are. If you have ever wondered whether you are within the range that research describes as normal, if you have ever felt self-conscious, uncertain, or quietly concerned, this video is for you. And the answer the research gives is almost certainly not what you have been led to believe. Hello, gentlemen. I'm Dr. Jocelyn, a board-certified urologist with over a decade of experience helping men over 55 address the physical and psychological dimensions of sexual health with clarity and confidence. Today, I'm giving you the honest, research-based answer to one of the most commonly asked questions in men's health, framed exactly the way I would frame it in a consultation room: factually, respectfully, and with your well-being at the center. The data on this topic is more reassuring than most men expect, and more nuanced than most popular sources acknowledge. A landmark study published in the British Journal of Urology International, conducted by researchers at King's College London, is the most comprehensive measurement study on record. It analyzed data from 15,521 men across multiple countries, with measurements taken under standardized clinical conditions. The study found that the average erect length globally falls between 5.1 and 5.5 inches, with an average girth of 4.5 to 4.7 inches in circumference. The average erect length is 5.1 to 5.5 inches. That single finding contradicts years of cultural messaging that has caused unnecessary psychological distress for a significant portion of the male population. Today, we are covering 4 dimensions of what the research actually shows, because the question of preference is more complex, more human, and ultimately more encouraging than a single number. Before we continue, hit that like button right now. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every response. And subscribe so you never miss evidence-based health guidance for men over 55. Now, let me show you exactly what the research reveals. Before we address preference, we need to establish medical context, because this conversation cannot be separated from anatomy, psychology, and the biology of sexual satisfaction. The relevant anatomy here involves the vaginal canal, the distribution of sensory nerve endings, and the neurological basis of physical pleasure. The vaginal canal in its resting state averages 3 to 4 inches in depth, expanding with arousal to approximately 5 to 7 inches through a process called vaginal tenting, the physiological lengthening and widening that occurs as blood flow increases to pelvic tissue. The highest concentration of sensory nerve endings, specifically mechanoreceptors and free nerve endings, is located in the outer 1/3 of the vaginal canal, not the deeper regions. This is an anatomical fact with direct implications for what physical characteristics actually contribute to pleasure. After age 50 in men, changes in vascular health, testosterone levels, and pelvic floor tone can all influence both function and confidence. Research from the Journal of Sexual Medicine found that erectile quality, not size, was the variable most strongly correlated with sexual satisfaction scores in partnered men over 55. One patient of mine, a 61-year-old man, came to me having avoided intimacy for nearly 2 years due to size-related anxiety. When I walked him through the anatomical and research evidence, he described the consultation as the most clarifying conversation about his body he had ever had. That is what this section of the video is intended to provide. What the research says about female preference and what it actually measures. This is the first dimension, and it requires careful interpretation of the evidence rather than a simplified headline. The most rigorous study on stated and demonstrated preference was published in PLOS One by researchers at UCLA and the University of New Mexico. The study presented 75 women aged 18 to 65 with 33 different 3-dimensional models varying in both length and girth, and asked them to select their preferences for both long-term partners and short-term encounters. For long-term partners, the preferred average length was 6.3 inches with a girth of 4.8 inches. For a single encounter, the preferred length was marginally higher at 6.4 inches. The preferred length was 6.3 inches. However, and this is the clinically critical point, the researchers noted that the range of models selected as acceptable spanned from 4.5 to 7 inches in length, representing the vast majority of the male population. Preference, in other words, exists within a wide and inclusive range. Think of it like this. Asking what length women prefer is like asking what height men prefer in a partner. There is a stated average, there is a wide acceptable range, and there is an enormous individual variation that renders the average far less meaningful than it initially appears. Here is what this means practically. If you fall within the 5.1 to 5.5 inch average documented in the King's College London study, you are within a range that the UCLA research confirms is selected by a substantial proportion of women as their preference for a long-term partner. The gap between average and stated preference in this research is smaller than cultural messaging suggests, and the overlap between those ranges is larger than most men realize. Beginning this week, I would encourage you to place the number you have been fixating on in the context of these actual research distributions, rather than the inflated comparisons that dominate popular media. One patient, 58 years old, came to me having spent years in what he described as a quiet crisis about this specific concern. When I showed him the actual distribution data from the King's College study alongside the UCLA preference research, he was visibly relieved. He told me, "Why has no doctor ever just shown me this data before? This conversation would have saved me years." Comment below. Was the average measurement from the King's College research higher or lower than you expected? The stated preference data gives us one layer of the picture, but the second dimension reveals something the preference studies alone cannot, and it changes the conversation entirely. The role of girth versus length in physical sensation. This is the second dimension, and it is arguably the most clinically significant finding in the research literature on this topic. Multiple independent studies have found that circumference, girth, is a stronger predictor of physical sensation and satisfaction than length for the majority of women. The reason is anatomical. The outer third of the vaginal canal, where nerve density is highest, responds primarily to lateral stretch, the sensation produced by girth, rather than to depth penetration produced by length. A study published in the Journal of Sex Research surveyed 323 sexually active women and found that 90% rated girth as equal to or more important than length for physical pleasure. 90%. Length beyond 5 to 6 inches was described by a majority of participants as either neutral or, in some cases, physically uncomfortable, particularly in certain positions. Think of it like this. The sensitivity of the inner ear does not depend on how deep a sound travels. It depends on how the eardrum vibrates. Girth is the vibration. Length, beyond a functional threshold, is simply more tunnel. Here is the practical implication. If your primary concern has been length, the research consistently redirects that concern toward a dimension where the average man is well within the range that produces the highest reported physical satisfaction. Average girth, documented at 4.5 to 4.7 inches in the King's College study, falls precisely within the range most associated with physical pleasure in the sensation research. Starting tonight, consider how much of your self-assessment has been based on a metric the research suggests is secondary to the one that actually matters most. One patient, 63 years old, came to me after years of anxiety specifically about length. When I explained the nerve distribution anatomy and walked him through the girth versus length research, his response was immediate. He told me, "I have been measuring the wrong thing for 40 years. Hit that like button if this reframing of the research was useful to you. The anatomical data addresses physical sensation, but the third dimension addresses something the numbers alone can never capture, and the research on it is among the most compelling in the entire field of sexual medicine. The primacy of non-physical factors in sexual satisfaction. This is the third dimension, and for men over 55, it may be the most important. A comprehensive meta-analysis published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine reviewed 173 studies involving over 33,000 participants and found that the factors most strongly correlated with female sexual satisfaction were emotional intimacy, communication quality, and partner attentiveness, not any physical measurement. Physical size ranked 11th out of 14 variables measured. 11th. Variables that outranked size included quality of communication, duration of the encounter, attentiveness to response, emotional safety, and confidence in the partner. Confidence specifically, not performance, not measurement, was listed as a top 5 predictor of satisfaction in partnered sexual encounters. Confidence was a top 5 predictor. This finding is not incidental. It reflects a biological reality. The autonomic nervous system, which governs physiological arousal in both partners, responds to psychological safety and perceived confidence in ways that directly amplify physical sensation. Think of it like this. A concert hall's acoustics are determined by its architecture, but whether the audience has a transcendent experience depends almost entirely on the quality of the performance inside it. Architecture sets the range. Performance determines the outcome. The practical recommendation here is direct. Invest in the variables you can actively develop: communication, attentiveness, emotional presence, and the confidence that comes from accurate information rather than cultural distortion. These are not consolation prizes for men who feel they fall short of an arbitrary standard. They are, according to the research, the primary drivers of the outcome both partners actually want. Beginning this week, if anxiety about physical measurement has been creating psychological distance in your intimate relationships, consider that the most evidence-based intervention available to you is not physical. It is informational and relational. One patient, 60 years old, came to me having withdrawn from intimacy almost entirely due to size-related anxiety that had compounded over years. We addressed the research together, and he began couples communication work alongside his medical care. At 4 months, he described his relationship as closer than it had been in a decade. He told me, "The problem was never what I thought the problem was. It was the anxiety about the problem." Comment below if this third dimension resonated with you. I want to know. The physical data and the psychological research give us 3 layers. The fourth dimension addresses something specific to men over 55, and it explains why this topic deserves a medical conversation, not just a cultural one. How aging affects this picture, and what men over 55 should actually be focused on. This is the fourth dimension, and it is the one most directly relevant to your health today. After age 55, several physiological changes occur that are more clinically significant than any measurement concern. Erectile rigidity, the firmness of an erection, is determined by vascular health, specifically the ability of the penile arteries to dilate and sustain blood flow. Research published in the International Journal of Impedance Research found that perceived size during an erection is directly influenced by erectile quality. Men with optimal vascular health and strong erections consistently reported and measured larger functional size than the same men with reduced erectile quality. In other words, cardiovascular health is penis health. The two are inseparable. A soft or partial erection functions at a fraction of its own potential, making erectile quality the single most impactful variable a man over 55 can address if size or performance is a concern. A study from the Massachusetts Male Aging Study, which followed 1,709 men over a 9-year period, found that men who exercised regularly, maintained healthy blood pressure, avoided smoking, and managed blood sugar had a 69% lower incidence of erectile dysfunction compared to sedentary men with metabolic risk factors. 69% lower. The lifestyle factors that protect the heart are the same factors that protect erectile function, perceived size, and sexual confidence. Think of it like this. A high-performance engine running on poor fuel and clogged lines will underperform its own specifications every time. Optimize the fuel and the lines, and the engine performs to its actual capacity. The practical protocol is clear. Prioritize cardiovascular health through regular aerobic exercise. Specifically, 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. Maintain healthy blood pressure and fasting glucose through diet, as vascular inflammation is the primary driver of erectile decline after 55. If you smoke, cessation is the single highest return investment in erectile health available to you. And speak with your physician about your testosterone levels, as hypogonadism, low testosterone, directly impairs both erectile quality and sexual confidence. Starting tonight, schedule a physician appointment to review your cardiovascular and hormonal health with this specific lens, not in 3 months, this week. One patient, 66 years old, came to me convinced his concerns were about size. After a thorough evaluation, we identified moderately reduced arterial blood flow and a testosterone level of 280 nanograms per deciliter, well below the functional optimum. After 6 months of cardiovascular intervention and physician-supervised hormonal support, he described his sexual health as better than it had been in his 50s. He told me, "I came in asking the wrong question. You helped me find the right one." If the connection between cardiovascular health and sexual function was new information for you, hit that like button, because this is something every man over 55 deserves to know. Now let me give you the complete protocol, everything synthesized into a clear, actionable plan. Tonight, review what you know about your current cardiovascular health. Do you know your blood pressure, your fasting glucose, your testosterone level? If not, these are the numbers that matter most for your sexual health after 55, more than any measurement you have been focused on. Write down what you do and do not know. Starting tomorrow, begin 30 minutes of moderate aerobic activity, walking, cycling, swimming, each day. This is the minimum evidence-based dose for vascular health improvement. If you are already exercising, add 1 session per week focused on pelvic floor strengthening, which directly supports erectile rigidity and ejaculatory control. This week, schedule a physician appointment and request a panel that includes fasting glucose, lipid profile, blood pressure assessment, and total and free testosterone. Frame it as a men's health optimization visit, not a complaint visit. This framing changes the conversation. This month and ongoing, replace any media-driven comparison with research-driven context. The data from King's College London and the UCLA preference study are publicly available. Read the actual research. The numbers are more reassuring than anything you have been told by popular culture. And invest in the communication and attentiveness variables that the meta-analysis identified as the primary drivers of satisfaction, because those are the variables with the highest return and the lowest ceiling. One patient, 59 years old, came to me carrying decades of quiet anxiety about this exact topic. He implemented the full protocol: cardiovascular work, hormonal optimization, research-based reframing, and relational communication work. At 6 months, he described a transformation that was physical, psychological, and relational simultaneously. He told me it was the first time in his adult life that he felt genuinely confident in this area. Not because anything dramatic had changed physically, but because he finally had accurate information. Gentlemen, here's what you need to understand. The anxiety that millions of men carry about this topic is built almost entirely on inaccurate data, cultural distortion, and the absence of honest medical conversation. The research tells a different story. The King's College London study of 15,521 men establishes that the global average falls between 5.1 and 5.5 inches, a number that contradicts decades of inflated cultural messaging. The UCLA research shows that female preference exists within a wide range, with an acceptable span that includes the overwhelming majority of men. The sensation research consistently identifies girth over length as the primary physical variable and places the average man well within the optimal range. The meta-analysis of 173 studies places physical size 11th out of 14 satisfaction variables, with confidence, communication, and attentiveness in the top 5. And the vascular research establishes that erectile quality, which is directly addressable through lifestyle and medical care, is the single most impactful physical variable available to men over 55. Starting tonight, schedule that physician appointment and begin replacing cultural noise with clinical fact. The most important measurement in your sexual health is not the one you have been focused on. It is the quality of the blood vessels that determine every dimension of your function and your confidence. If this video gave you something genuinely useful, hit that like button right now. Comment below and tell me, was there a finding in today's research that surprised you or shifted how you think about this topic? I read every response and I want to know. And subscribe for more evidence-based health guidance for men over 55, delivered with the honesty and respect you deserve. Now, if you want to go even deeper, watch this video next. It covers the 5 lifestyle changes that most directly improve erectile quality and sexual confidence after 55, and it builds on everything we discussed today. I'm Dr. Jocelyn. Accurate information is the foundation of genuine confidence. Take care of yourselves, gentlemen.